In 1886, deep in a hidden chamber in Egypt, archaeologists unwrapped a mummy that made them recoil. Its head was thrown back. Its jaw was wrenched wide open. Its face was frozen, forever in what looked exactly like a scream. Every other royal mummy around him was carefully embalmed, wrapped in fine white linen, named and blessed for the afterlife. Not this one. He was wrapped in the skin of a goat, a material the Egyptians considered unclean. His hands and feet were bound. No name was written anywhere on him. Someone had gone to great trouble not just to kill this man, but to damn him for eternity. For over a century, no one knew who he was or why he was screaming. Then modern science cracked the case and revealed a story of assassination inside the royal palace, a secret plot led by a queen and a prince punished with a fate worse than death. Tonight, the screaming mummy and the 3,000-year-old murder that DNA finally solved. To understand the screaming man, you first have to understand the king whose murder created him. His name was Ramesses III, and he was the last truly great pharaoh of ancient Egypt. He ruled in the 20th dynasty, from around 1186 to 1155 BC, over 3,000 years ago, during a period when the Egyptian empire, once the unrivaled superpower of the ancient world, was beginning its long decline. And Ramesses III spent his reign holding back the tide. His was an age of chaos across the whole eastern Mediterranean. Mysterious raiders that historians call the Sea Peoples were sweeping across the region, toppling entire civilizations. Ramesses III fought them off in massive land and sea battles, defending Egypt when other great kingdoms were collapsing around it. He fought Libyans. He kept the empire intact. He built enormous monuments, including his great temple at Medinet Habu, whose walls still stand today. He was, by every measure, a powerful and successful king, the last pharaoh who could still make Egypt feel like the empire it had once been. But his reign was also strained. There was economic trouble, drought, and unrest. In fact, during his rule, history records what may be the first documented labor strike in human history. The workers who built the royal tombs, unpaid and hungry, downed their tools in protest. The cracks in the Golden Empire were showing, and the most dangerous cracks of all were inside his own household. And if a good historical murder mystery is your kind of thing, take a quick second to subscribe. It really helps the channel. And there's much more like this coming. Now, into the palace. Because like the pharaohs before him, Ramesses III maintained a royal harem, not merely in the sensational modern sense, but as a formal political institution. A principal wife, several secondary wives, and all of their children living together within the palace complex. And a household like that, full of rival wives, each hoping to see her own son inherit the throne of the most powerful position in the known world, was a pressure cooker of ambition. In that gilded palace, the stakes of motherhood were the stakes of empire, and one of those secondary wives was about to gamble everything. Because inside the walls of Ramesses III's own palace, a plot was taking shape to murder him, and it was led by a member of his own family. Her name was Ti. She was one of Ramesses III's secondary wives, and she had a son named Pentaweri. And Ti had a problem. Her son was not the heir. Ramesses III had designated a different son, the child of his principal wife, as his successor, the prince who would become Ramesses IV. In the brutal arithmetic of royal succession, that meant Ti's son Pentaweri was destined for a life in the shadow of his half-brother's throne, and Ta herself would never be the mother of a king. So, according to the ancient records, Ti decided to change the outcome by force. She would have the pharaoh assassinated and place her own son on the throne. And remarkably, we know about this in extraordinary detail because the ancient Egyptians wrote it down. There survives a document that scholars call the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, an actual court record of the trial that followed. It is one of the most astonishing legal documents to survive from the ancient world, the transcript of the prosecution of the people who conspired to kill a pharaoh. And the conspiracy it describes was large. This was not one desperate woman acting alone. Ti, the papyrus tells us, built a network of co-conspirators reaching across the royal household, other members of the harem, and crucially, officials with real power, military officers, civil administrators, and men in charge of the harem itself. She even, according to the documents, tried to reach outside the palace to stir up support. The plan involved magic wax figures intended to weaken the guards and the king. And it aimed to strike during a great religious festival when the palace routine was disrupted and the king was perhaps more exposed. The target was the throat of the last great pharaoh of Egypt. And for 3,000 years, one enormous question hung over the whole affair, unanswered. Did it work? Here is what makes this case so strange. The judicial papyrus tells us all about the plot and all about the trial that punished the plotters. But it never plainly states the one thing we most want to know, whether the assassination itself actually succeeded. For a long time, historians genuinely did not know. There were two possibilities, and serious scholars argued both. The first possibility, the plot failed. The conspirators were caught before they could kill the king, or they wounded him and he survived, or the attempt fell apart, and Ramesses III lived on, tried the traitors, and died later of natural causes, an old man whose enemies had been crushed. The fact that his designated heir, Ramesses IV, did take the throne seemed to support this. The plot to install Pentawere had clearly failed in its ultimate goal. So maybe the murder failed too. The second possibility, the plot succeeded in the killing, even if it failed in the coup. Maybe the conspirators did assassinate Ramesses III, but the loyalists rallied afterward, seized control, put the rightful heir on the throne, and hunted down the killers. In that version, the king was murdered, and his death was quietly avenged, the wound to the royal image hidden away. For over a century, the mummy of Ramesses III sat in a museum, and no one could tell which story was true. When his body had been unwrapped back in the 19th century, it showed no obvious wound. He appeared to have died peacefully. The case looked like it might stay unsolved forever because you cannot exactly re-interview a 3,000-year-old corpse. Or, as it turned out, you can. You just need the right technology. And in 2012, the technology finally arrived. Because in 2012, a team of scientists put the mummy of Ramesses III into a CT scanner and found what human eyes had missed for over 100 years. The reason the earlier examinations found nothing was hiding in plain sight. Around the mummy's throat was a thick, oddly bulky collar of linen bandages, more layers than would normally be there. When the body was first unwrapped in the 19th century, no one disturbed that neck wrapping, and so no one saw what it concealed. But a CT scanner sees straight through linen into the body beneath. And when the team looked beneath those bandages, they found the answer to the century-old question. Ramesses III's throat had been cut. The scan revealed a deep, wide gash across the front of his neck, a wound roughly 2.5 to 3 inches across, so deep that it had sliced through the trachea, the esophagus, and the great blood vessels of the neck, cutting all the way down to the spine. This was not a superficial injury. It was a killing blow, delivered with a sharp blade that would have caused death within seconds to minutes. There was no surviving this. The last great pharaoh of Egypt had his throat slashed open, and the embalmers had known. That thick linen collar wasn't ordinary wrapping. It was a cover-up, quite literally. They had wrapped the fatal wound to conceal it, to restore the king's dignity, to hide the shameful truth that the god king had been butchered by his own household. In an even more remarkable detail, the scan revealed that the embalmers had tucked a small amulet, a protective eye of Horus charm, down inside the wound itself, a magical attempt to heal the injury for the afterlife. They were trying to fix his severed throat in eternity. So the century-old question had its answer at last. The plot worked. Ramesses III was assassinated, his throat cut almost certainly during that festival by the conspirators of the harem. And later analysis suggested the attack may have been even more savage than a single cut. A re-examination found that one of the king's big toes had been chopped off, possibly by an axe or heavy blade, hinting that more than one attacker struck him with more than one weapon in a frenzied, close assault. The king was murdered. The case of Ramesses III was solved. But that same investigation turned its attention to a second body, the screaming one, and asked a different question. If this is how the king died, then who was the man who was buried screaming beside him, damned for all eternity? Because the screaming mummy had been a mystery even longer than the murder, and solving one turned out to solve the other. Let's go back to that contorted body. He had been found in the 19th century in a truly remarkable place, and the story of that place is worth telling, because it's how he survived to be studied at all. For centuries, the royal tombs of Egypt had been plagued by robbers. The magnificent burials of the pharaohs, stuffed with gold and treasure, were irresistible targets, and by the end of the New Kingdom, tomb robbing had become rampant. The priests of a later era faced a crisis. The sacred bodies of Egypt's greatest kings were being desecrated, their tombs broken open, their mummies torn apart for the jewels wrapped inside them. So those priests did something extraordinary. In secret, they gathered up the mummies of the endangered pharaohs, kings and queens who had ruled centuries apart, rescued them, rewrapped some of the damaged ones, and hid them together in secret caches where the robbers could not find them. One of the greatest of these hiding places was a concealed tomb in the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, near the Valley of the Kings. Behind a hidden entrance, down a shaft in the rock, they sealed away a collection of Egypt's royal dead, some of the most famous pharaohs in history, lying side by side in the dark waiting out the centuries. And there they stayed, secret and safe, for nearly 3,000 years, until the late 19th century, when the cache was rediscovered, reportedly after a local family found it and began quietly selling off artifacts, drawing the attention of the authorities. When archaeologists finally entered that hidden chamber, they found themselves face to face with a roomful of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. And among all those honored kings and queens lay this one disturbing exception. A body catalogued, for lack of any identity, as simply unknown man E. Everything about his burial screamed punishment, the exact opposite of what a royal Egyptian burial was supposed to be. To the ancient Egyptians, proper mummification was not a luxury. It was essential. Your body had to be carefully preserved for your soul to live on in the afterlife. To deny someone proper mummification was to try to destroy their very soul, to condemn them to eternal non-existence. It was the worst punishment imaginable, and unknown man E had been denied everything. His internal organs were not removed in the careful ritual way. His body appears to have been left to dry out with natural salts, hastily and crudely, rather than lovingly embalmed. He was wrapped not in pure white linen, but in the skin of a sheep or goat, ritually unclean, an abomination to place on a body meant for eternity. His hands and feet may have been bound, and no name, no inscription, no protective spell was written anywhere near him. In a culture where your name surviving was part of how your soul survived, his erasure was total. Someone wanted this man not just dead, but obliterated from eternity itself. And then there was his face, that open-mouthed, head-back, agonized expression that earned him his nickname. For decades, people looked at that scream and imagined the worst, that he had been buried alive, or poisoned in agony, his final scream frozen onto his face forever. So who was he? For over a century, one name hovered around this body as the leading guess: Pentawere. Prince Pentawere, the son of Queen Tia, the very prince the whole conspiracy had been meant to crown. Because we know from the judicial papyrus what happened to Pentawere after the plot failed. He was put on trial, found guilty of conspiring in his father's murder, and being of royal blood, he was not executed like the lower conspirators. Instead, he was compelled to take his own life, and a traitor who had killed his own father, the God King, would absolutely have been denied a proper burial, damned deliberately for his crime. It fit perfectly. But fitting a story is not proof. For over 100 years, it remained just a compelling theory. Until the same 2012 study that solved the king's murder tested the screaming man's DNA. And the results were striking. Unknown man E shared the same Y chromosome signature as Ramesses III, and half of his DNA, exactly the pattern you would expect between a father and his son. The screaming mummy was genetically a son of the murdered pharaoh. combined with the deliberately degrading burial, the sheepskin, the missing name, the hasty non-embalming, all the marks of a punished traitor, the evidence pointed hard at the conclusion everyone had suspected. This was very likely Pentawere, the prince who plotted his father's death, was condemned, took his own life, and was buried in a way designed to destroy his soul forever. Now, let me be honest about the edges of this, because good history means admitting what we don't know. The DNA proves he was a son of Ramesses III, but it cannot spell out the name Pentawere. The pharaoh had several sons, and the specific identification rests on the papyrus plus that damning burial, not on the genes alone. And the famous scream may be less dramatic than it looks. Many Egyptologists think the open mouth isn't an expression of agony at all, but simply what happens when a jaw is never tied shut, and the head falls back as the body dries, a natural result of a rushed, careless mummification, not a preserved moment of horror. On the other hand, the study did find his lungs were strangely overinflated, which some researchers read as a possible sign of death by suffocation or strangulation, perhaps consistent with a forced hanging. So the scream may be an accident of decay, or it may be the last trace of how he died. Even now, we cannot be completely sure. But the shape of the story is clear, and it is remarkable. A queen plots to murder her husband, the pharaoh, to crown her son. The assassination succeeds. The king's throat is cut. But the coup fails. The rightful heir takes the throne, and the conspirators are hunted down. The queen's son is condemned, forced to die, and buried in deliberate disgrace, wrapped in unclean skin, and stripped of his name so that his soul can never rest. And 3,000 years later, hidden among the honored dead, his screaming face still tells the story. There is a terrible symmetry to it all. Ramesses III, the great king, had his throat cut by his own family, and his embalmers loved him enough to hide the wound, to tuck a healing charm into the gash, to send him into eternity whole and dignified, his murder disguised. They fought to preserve his soul. His son, the traitor, got the opposite. No disguise, no dignity, no charm, no name. Wrapped in the skin of a goat, hands bound, left to dry in disgrace. An active, deliberate effort to erase his soul from existence forever. Two members of one family, murdered in the same conspiracy, sent into eternity in exactly opposite ways, one lovingly hidden, one deliberately damned. And yet, here is the irony the ancient Egyptians never could have foreseen. The punishment was meant to make Pentawere disappear, to obliterate him from memory and from the afterlife for all time. Instead, he became immortal in the one way that actually lasted. 3,000 years later, he is not forgotten. He is famous. Millions of people around the world know the screaming mummy. He lies now not in disgrace in a hidden pit, but on public display in a museum in Cairo, one of the most recognized faces from all of ancient Egypt. The prince his own people tried to erase from eternity is remembered today, better than almost any loyal son who was buried with honor. They tried to damn him to be forgotten forever, and forever, it turns out, remembered him anyway, still screaming, across 3,000 years, the last sound of a palace murder that time could not bury. If this story gripped you, leave a comment and tell me, do you think he died screaming? Or was it the embalmer's neglect? And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more mummies, murders, and ancient mysteries still to uncover.